What is up, you guys? It's Aisling. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video I'm going to be talking about my top 5 eyeshadow palettes of 2020. I always do a roundup of my high-end, my drugstore, my miscellaneous favorites of a particular year. But this year I want to kind of introduce like my top palettes of the year. I really feel like these videos are helpful. I always watch like what eyeshadow palettes people like, especially if it's somebody who has similar tastes to myself. And definitely the year that was in it, I found that there was only about 5 eyeshadow palettes I was using throughout the whole entire year. So I thought I might talk to you guys about them today. Most of them are like pretty affordable. I think there's one really expensive one, but the rest of them are pretty affordable. Definitely talked about all these palettes before, so if you have seen these before, I hope I'm not like repeating myself. If you're interested in picking up a new eyeshadow palette, this might be why you've stumbled upon this video, and I would love to hear what eyeshadow palette you absolutely love and the ones that you would recommend. I decluttered all my eyeshadow palettes this year, and I just used what I had in my collection, not buying anything new and just using what was already there and learning to love certain palettes, and you know, any palettes that I found that I hadn't been using in about 6 months to a year, got rid of. I donated a lot to my family and friends. I just feel so much better and lighter for decluttering. Anyway, that was such a long intro. Let's get into the palettes that I used most often in 2020. The first one I want to talk about is Jaclyn Hill's palette. I know I've spoken at length about this palette in the past, but I felt like it needed to be talked about again today because it was a favorite of mine in 2020. You can see that there's a lot of love for this palette. It is looking like a hot mess at the moment. I can't even remember when I got this. More than likely this palette has expired 10 times over, but it's a fail-safe palette for me. It's one I go back to continuously. It's one that I pick up when I don't know what to do with my eye makeup look on a particular day. I've used it today to create this eye look. I absolutely adore it. There's nothing I can say negative about it. I've mentioned before about wishing one of these was matte. That's about the kind of only complaint. I have an in-depth video on it. It is kind of old, but I'll link it down below. Everything that I said in it is still relevant. And I 100% think that this is a palette for a newbie or someone who's just wanting to add something to their collection. It's not up at the standards of like Charlotte Tilbury, but it is at a really good, exceptional level when it comes to eyeshadows. They are not powdery. I don't get fallout from them. I don't find that they fade throughout the day. I love how pigmented a lot of the shades are. I love the quality of them. I just love the pops of color in this palette, especially like the blue. And I just really like how easy they are to blend, because that is like one of my biggest things when it comes to eyeshadows is blendability. I don't want something that blends into a mush, and I don't want something that disappears throughout the day, and I don't want something that's difficult to blend. I don't want to have to work for hours and hours on an eyeshadow to get it to blend. They're not patchy eyeshadows by any means, and I just really recommend them. So without this eyeshadow palette this year, I would have been lost, because it's just such a good one. And in general in life, it's such a good eyeshadow palette. I cannot recommend it enough. The next eyeshadow palette I want to talk about is a really affordable one. I mentioned this in my drugstore favorites of 2020, so it might sound like Groundhog Day again, but I just wanted to talk about this palette again because it is such an amazing palette. It is the Next Generation Pro palette from Catrice, and these are the shades that you get in it. They are so pretty. It is just such a great palette. I got this in February in Pure, sent out to me, and I wore it on Valentine's Day. I wore it like all the month of February. I dip into this every now and again when I want something like a romantic kind of date night eye look. I know that sounds so cliche. When you look at like pinks, you're like, oh yeah, date night. Oh, but I just really enjoy the pigmentation in these eyeshadows. I feel like they're very blendable. They're not patchy. They don't fall out down my face. I have mentioned in the past Catrice eyeshadows that have not worked for me, that have been featured in failed videos. Eyeshadow palettes from Catrice that have just been complete duds. They don't show up in the eye, and the pigmentation of them is so poor that it just like wipes away. You could literally wipe it away with your finger. Whereas I feel like this has been formulated in a way that it is much more superior to anything that they've ever brought out before. The eyeshadows swatch really nice. I did like a whole dedicated video on it. It is an €11 palette. It's a little bit more expensive than most drugstore kind of items. I usually feel like drugstore would stop around like the €7 mark for an eyeshadow palette, but it is worth every cent, to be fair. And the quality of the shades and just the blendability, everything about them is so great. I love how slim this is, and this is always a palette I will bring to my boyfriend's house because I know it has everything in it and it's small and compact that I need to use. And I feel like I said, you can make daytime looks out of it, more kind of deeper looks with the shade Brave as well. It can add more depth to it. I love like the pink shades in it, and then you have like this lovely peachy shade with gorgeous shimmering shades that show up on the eye. I just highly recommend this if you haven't given it a go. The next palette I want to talk about is the Warm Neutrals Volume 2 from Sigma. I don't think I've mentioned this year, but it has been one of my fail-safe eyeshadow palettes. I go back to this constantly. My favourite shades being Toasty and Henna for everyday makeup looks, and Bittersweet sometimes I'll throw into the eye. And then also Humble just for, you know, some under the brow kind of pop in action. I really feel like this eyeshadow palette is underrated. It's not spoken about. It's so great. And the pigmentation, again, of these shades is outstanding. But there's some of the shades. They're so pigmented. You can see that from the swatches, like they're quite intense and they blend really well. There's no patchiness from these eyeshadows. So I do find when you go with like darker eyeshadows or something like that's red, you can tend to get a bit of patchiness on the eye when you are blending it if the quality of the shadow is poop. I would say this is a great quality palette. It is really small and compact. I love how it can get so many different looks with this as well. And even though you look at it, you kind of think that you're just stuck with, you know, a neutral eye look, with the reds and the greens in it and just some of these burgundy shades and the pinks give you a different vibe than just something neutral like with the browns. I feel like it's a really, really, really great palette. There's no shade in it that I don't really dip into. No, I would say I use all of them from one time to another. It's a palette that I continuously go back to. And like I said, because there's so few shades in it, like there's only 12 shades in it, you don't get overwhelmed like maybe you would if you got the Jaclyn Hill palette. You're like, what the hell do I use? Like, I'm just sticking to the neutrals. I feel like with this one, I get a little bit more inspiration from them because I don't get as overwhelmed with shades, if that makes sense. Next up, I want to talk about the Nude palette from Huda Beauty. This, or New Nude it's called. This palette has been featured in a few videos before, and I've definitely done a couple of tutorials with it. I think the last time you would have seen this on my channel was probably in December when I did a makeup look, like an everyday makeup look with it. It's just one of my favorite formulations and layouts of colors. Personally, I love these type of shades. Obviously, if you don't like these type of shades, this palette is not going to be for you. Purples and these like pinky shades are just right up my alley. And then I love that the fact that this side is kind of a little bit more neutral and you just get a bit more of a pop of color and shimmer on the other side. I really, really, really like the formula of these shades. And I kind of went back and forth between this palette when I first got it because I was like, I'm not really sure if I'm that keen on it. But I have been honestly picking it up non-stop in 2020, so I have to be that keen on it if I'm using it that often. This shade down here, the concealer, is the most irrelevant thing ever. I wish that they didn't have this in here and that we had another great colour, but it is what it is. So just to warn you when you are purchasing that, if you do see the concealer shade down there and you're like, what the hell do you do with this? Yeah, I don't really understand what you're to do with it either, because it doesn't really blend very nicely onto the eye. And it's kind of like a sticky, dry formula that doesn't really do a whole lot. It just leaves my lid feeling sticky and nothing really blends on top of it. I feel like all the eyeshadows fall down into it more than anything. Again, the shades swatch really, really well, and they definitely maintain their colour that you see in the palette. So kind of what you see is what you get. I hate when you swatch something that's really deep and purple like this and then you go to blend it on the eye and it just fades away to nothing or it looks patchy. You don't get anything like that from this palette. I love the shimmers in it as well, and I love mixing them. I can't say enough good things about this palette, especially the colour selection, and it's something very unique as well. I mean, not since this palette has come out can I say it's unique, because before it was kind of like the first of its kind, and now I feel like an awful lot of brands are trying to dupe it. Like even that Catrice one, you slightly get the vibe from this palette with that one. It is a bit pricier. I think it's about €65, or maybe is it more expensive than that? I dread to even think. But it was worth it for me. I purchased this about a year and a half ago and I do use it quite a lot, and definitely one of the most used palettes of 2020. The final palette I want to talk about that I've been loving in 2020 is going to come as no surprise, because you're probably wondering where it's been up until now. I did mention this in my high-end favorites of 2020 also. Just kind of want to reiterate a little bit of what I said in that video but not rant on too much about it. It is the KVD Vegan Beauty. This is the Lolita Por Vida palette. I did a full review of this way back when, I want to say like February maybe, or January even. So nearly a whole year ago of me completely loving this palette. I cannot say enough good things about this. This is definitely my holy grail palette. I did mention in my high-end favorites of 2020 that if I could only have 5 eyeshadow palettes for the rest of my life, this would be one of them. It is one of my favorite eyeshadow palettes ever, for nothing more than the quality of the eyeshadows. I think they are more superior to even any of the palettes I've talked about today, and the Huda Beauty one is a lot more expensive than this, but I feel like the eyeshadows in this are like nothing I've ever used before. The only ones that I can kind of see similarities to are the eyeshadows from Charlotte Tilbury palette that I got in February. I can't remember the name of it. I think it's the Pillow Talk palette. That was unbelievable, the quality of it, but I just feel like I don't reach for it as much because I kind of get everything I want from this and from the Huda Beauty nude palette, and I just don't reach for the Charlotte Tilbury as much. Actually, I must start using that a lot more because it is a beautiful palette. But anyway, I feel like the quality of these eyeshadows are just exceptional. I have never felt eyeshadows as creamy ever. And they're not just creamy in the pan, they're creamy on the lid, and they just blend so well. Like there's no skipping, they don't go patchy, they look just like what they do in the pan, and they come off so pretty onto the eyelid. They're just gorgeous eyeshadows. The formulation is just spot on. I cannot stop raving about the formulation of them because I was actually so surprised, because I used the KVD Vegan Beauty, the Shade and Light palette for so long, and I just don't feel like the quality of the shadows mirrors this. Like these are so much better than the Shade and Light palette, and I hope that they've reformulated Shade and Light, because I would definitely probably use that palette again. I actually donated my other one because I just felt like I wasn't using it enough, and I just wasn't overly crazy about the formula, whereas this is on another level and so good. So if you are looking for an eyeshadow palette with just something a little bit more different in it, because I feel like this isn't like your run-of-the-mill eyeshadow palette. It looks different to any eyeshadow palette I have in my collection, especially like those copper shades and the brown. I've mentioned this every single time I talk about this palette, but it's like 2 in 1. You get this more neutral side and then this more like purpley side. This shade up here, Carino, is one of my absolute favorites ever, and Luna underneath. They're so pretty. I've done about a million eyeshadow looks with this at this stage. I feel like this is also beginner friendly because of how easy it blends on the eye, whereas I feel like there's so many eyeshadow palettes out there that when you pick them up you kind of have to work a little bit harder at them. They're not beginner friendly, and then as a newbie to makeup or a beginner, you just feel really disheartened with the eyeshadows. So if you are starting out with makeup, that palette is a go-to. I cannot recommend it enough. And also if you're a collector of makeup and you've nothing like that in your collection and you want it, I recommend it also. Thank you so much guys for watching today's video. I hope that you found an eyeshadow palette maybe that you hadn't tried before. Again, I'm gonna do these like every year, so the palettes will probably change from year to year, and I find it really fun to kind of see what I was drawn to in a particular year versus the next year, because 2020 was obviously a year of not really doing too much, not going out, not clubbing or whatever. Year of the neutral eye for me and the fox eye. I did an awful lot of experimenting with that this year. So I would love to hear what your favorite palette of 2020 was, and if you did like today's video then you can give it a thumbs up. It really helps me out, and I will talk to all of you guys in my next video. Mwah. Bye guys.